Thank you. Hello, I'm going to get us started here. I have about 5-10 minutes before class starts to talk about your papers because there's a lot of confusion. The assignment's up there, and I really want us to get completely clear right now about our expectations. We know you can do this. We apologize for any part in the confusion we've played, but let me just talk a little bit about our expectations in relation to this. It might have been a little thick on the language. And so in thinking through this, I suggest you flip around 1 and 2 and start with the second one. And that is to select an issue that relates to food that has interested you this semester. One way to gauge what has interested you is what you've talked about outside of class, what conversations you've initiated, and what has been something that you've continued to think about outside of classroom setting. I had dinner the other night. I just have to tell you this one thing. Had dinner the other night with Diane Nelson from Anthropology. And one of you, she didn't give me a name, said that one of you started talking to her about the class that's enrolled in it from an anthro major, cult anthro, and said and Diane said, well, what's the takeaway of the class? Yeah, it was a good class. So Diane said, what's the takeaway of class? And the student said, well, we should buy more expensive food and spend more money on food. And, and Diane was like, what are you telling him, to go to Magnolia Grill? And I'm like, no. And I got to thinking about that comment, that was the takeaway for the student from this class. And, this could be completely manufactured in my mind, but that doesn't surprise me coming from cultural anthropology. It's historically a department that's very invested in poverty, very invested in critiques of capitalism, and not so invested in environment, not so invested in non-humans, and that, the takeaway that student came up with made a little bit of sense. That's the way we want you thinking here. If you go back to the first class we met together, and Dean Patton talked about knowledge being circulated inside silos. And the university is sort of pockets of knowledge that don't often get to circulate with each other because it's all about this kind of knowledge versus this kind of knowledge. In this final paper, we're asking you to make a bridge between at least 2 silos. So, start with a topic. Figure something that matters to your heart. Local versus industrial, organics, agrarian versus state-based interventions, urban gardening, marketing, questions of disgust in marketing, meat and animal welfare, human labor, GMOs, world hunger, environmental concerns, North Carolina as a state, whatever. Think about what you talked about the most and focus in on that. Then ask yourself, what are the disciplinary forces that help to form me and help to form the way I take up a position on this issue? Just like cult anth being kind of more invested in human poverty than other things, what in your disciplinary world pushes you to think or helps shape you to think one way versus another about the issue? Then, that's all step 1. Then step 2 is find somebody who also is interested in the issue and disagrees with you. That person has to be from another discipline, and I'll explain why in a minute. Well, basically because we don't want you stuck in your silo. Find somebody, and it doesn't have to be somebody in the class. It can be one of our authors. It can be one of our speakers. All of the talks throughout the class are on video. You can watch it again. Find somebody who you think takes up the other side than you, and ask what in their disciplinary background helped form them to take that position. So the point we're trying to get at here is that disciplines and schools of thought, and in professional schools especially, shape the way we take up positions, but they do not determine them. That's why the university is not about judging or solving problems. It's about circulating worldviews. having a better understanding of different backgrounds in the task of the university, not simply to resolve the debates, is our job in this class. Then finally, ask if the two traditions, if the two disciplines together help shed light differently on the problem you're thinking about. So I'm going to run through a quick example to help show all this and then take your questions. And I'm going to use GMO food precisely because we haven't heard the lectures on it. That's what we're getting today. This is just an example. One does not have to write about GM at all. It's come up several times throughout the semester, and I thought it was a good way to think about it. So, for example, one could say from a position of Christian theological ethics that GM is wrong because it's playing God. We saw a little bit of that earlier with Wurzba. We could also imagine from a position of Christian ethics that anyone who took up the social gospel and the plight of the poor might be for GM because it would increase yield or increase harvest. Now, this is a great way to show you why we don't want two Christian ethics people talking to each other in this final paper, because the two of you would get into a war within your silo, right? It would be quoting this biblical verse versus that biblical verse, this, theologian versus that theologian. The class has an investment in getting you outside your arena of knowledge. So you've got to make your field talk to somebody who starts from a completely different place. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me just give you other perspectives on GM. I sat one night thinking through how many positions could I come up with. In the history of someone like Jed Purdy, Thoreau, and Emerson, wrong, because we are fighting against nature. We are going against what the natural world would want. In the perspective of other legal theory, like Michelle Nowen, it might be right because corporations have the power to pursue profit, and GMs can increase that. Might be wrong from critical legal theory because there should be more controls on what corporations can do to pursue profit, but it might be right from, say, public policy like Phyllis Pomerantz gave us, because the outcome might be to bring more nutrients to starving areas. I'm just going to go through. From a scientific point of view, it might be right because science has carefully made sure there are no unforeseen dangers through careful experimentation, right? That's the position that many scientists and engineers take up on GM. From agrarian philosophy, though, it might be wrong because science has been wrong about technology like DDT before. It might be wrong because the primary reason we modify food is to reduce cost, and we should be paying more money for our food, right? That's the locavore agrarian position. Food should be a higher part of our budget. And it might be right because without cheap foods, lots of people, right here in Durham even, would go hungry. It might be wrong because a journalist might find out that people don't want it, and it might be right because an anthropologist might find out that people are really hungry and need it. It might be wrong because GM food tampers with food sovereignty, not allowing farmers to grow what they want, but it also might be right in that it allows starving areas to produce food security, to have food security. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's no correlation inherent between your discipline and the position you take. It can be almost infinite number of things. You have to make that argument, and then you have to make the argument with somebody who takes the opposite and see the world from their shoes. Questions? Yes. That you don't have? I mean, I think you should work that out with your TA. If you are in a discipline and you're not really sure how it's forming you, I guess that would be okay. But mostly, you should be, we want you to be clear about the the things that shape your worldview as you leave here, and to not take that opportunity. I mean, maybe your discipline has nothing to say about it, and we could think about it then. But in general, I think this is about self-reflection as much as it is conversation. I mean, I guess, like, I don't know, does music have anything to say about food? I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think it would be important for us, I'll just stand up, to think about what we bring to our thinking about food from our own discipline. I think that gives us a chance to reflect. If it's a cognate discipline, then who was the person that asked the question? I want to make sure I pose. Yeah. So give me your discipline, tell me what discipline you're thinking of, and then we can really go to town.
Well, I'm in psychology.
Yes.
But I was thinking of
Urban ag versus agribusiness, yeah. Sure.
That's a job, but you can do it.
I think so, in the following way, which is, in what way does psychology lead you to think about urban ag in a particular way? Right? What brings you to a perspective on urban ag from your psychological perspective? That doesn't have to be all of it, but it can be a part of it. And then thinking about what draws you to urban ag from your disciplinary perspective. Again, it doesn't have to be all of it, but it can be part of it. And then moving to more rural ag as a counterpart. I think that's more than appropriate. I think what we're looking for is reflection on what your disciplinary approach is and how it influences your larger approach to food to begin with, and then where you might move in disagreement and how actually you learn from that disagreement.
Right. And think
Does
about,
that make sense? Go forward.
I mean, psychology is a discipline focused on the human. You don't really have environmental psychology, right? So once you're already in the game of focusing on the human, you've given up territory that, say, a lot of people in this room interested in the environment would not want to give up. It's that kind of thinking we're pushing here. Does that make sense?
No.
I guess
Ask more.
It was about taking three different perspectives from the class that weren't necessarily, our own discipline. So I'm just trying to figure out how you're
Tell me what draws you to, which is the point that you feel more connected to, which focus? The urban ag. So tell me why what draws you to urban ag?
Well, I guess just sort of the alternative response to problem solving.
Okay, great. And why the focus on the community is interesting to you? What do you think is empowering about that? I mean, in other words, to make that connection, you don't have to do a deep connection around that if you really want to go into the urban ag thing. It's more making the connection that we're interested in. And then go to town on urban ag and rural ag. Does that make that a little clearer? Yeah. Other questions? I mean, maybe we could hear from people some examples of what people are thinking about doing so that it feels like it's a doable thing. Yeah. There was somebody vacuuming, and I couldn't hear half of what you just said. If you could just speak up. You were about to say maybe what we could do is.
That's an idea. That would be for the last one. We definitely can think about it, getting some of the professional schools to circle into the 4 groups. You're an undergrad? And so do you have an undergrad group or do you have a group that's all undergrad? Yeah, so there are 4 groups that don't have access to professional schools. Maybe we could get some of the professional school students to cycle through them.
We could do that. Another possibility also to help people feel like they're on the right track with the papers is to spend some of the last discussion group sharing outlines or potential outlines for the paper so that people get a sense of where others might be going. We could probably do both. We could have some of the discussion group about sharing the outlines and then some of the discussion group about where people are coming from. But my guess is you also have different majors in your discussion group, right?
Yeah, but I think it's still like the way that our classes are set up, they're different at different universities. And even if they're not, even if they're different fees, they're not spending credit. And that's all.
Yeah.
Never ever just the same class.
Yeah. That's the rhetoric of Duke liberal arts, but the reality underneath it is often that you really are kind of formed. What's your major? Yes, you know, I mean, all you need to do is talk with this person in cultural anthropology. You guys are like this far apart on these issues. And, you know, Emo-Eth is a fabulous department because their investment is going to be in the non-human. I don't know what you're going to take up or what your topic is, but, you know, they're environmental, they're evolutionary, they're historical, and I think that you're formed by them. What we're asking you to do is entertain the possibility that you are formed by your department more than you think you are. That's all. And maybe you want to quarrel with it. I'll take any email, Hey Ruby, and I love writing email. My TA would. So I'll take any email and discuss this stuff with you. I've been at Duke 20 years and know a lot of the departments. So email me if you want to have a discussion about how to think about how your department has influenced you.
And just making that, so part of what I've noticed in being a new arrival at Duke is there isn't that much opportunity at Duke for people to reflect on their education. And it's really important for me as a dean to make sure I create as many of those opportunities as possible. And I can kind of tell from people going, whoa, you know, what are the basics of my field, that it's a really great opportunity for people to think about that. So that might be good for you to think about in this coming week as well, sort of what are the basic ideas of my major that might be different than other majors. Even though I share ideas with a lot of folks, the way you come at the study of the human in terms of evolution and understandings of evolution is real different than an economics major who's going to look at cost-benefit analysis, right? That kind of stuff is what I'm getting at. Does that make sense? Okay. There was another question. Yeah.
Super point, though, I think it would make sense to have a little more intermingling between the different schools. For example, all of the business school students are in our group. So I think we really reinforce our
I'll
You
work it
guys
out
have
for next week, that you know, I'll write to the TAs tonight and we'll figure out a plan. Maybe we have a mixer next week.
Right.
Instead of
Everybody, yeah.
small group
Yeah.
discussion or something.
That's great. But also you've seen a lot of the different approaches in the lectures as well, right? So you've seen how different a biology person is from a economics person, from an urban ag. Remind me of your name in the Heather? Okay, yeah. So Heather's example was really great, right? So you have ag in both cases, but you have urban ag on one hand and you know, a kind of rural pastoral understanding on the other, and they come from really different understandings of what community is, what it means to create alternatives, you know, et cetera. And it's a really interesting way to think about that. So even in the lectures, there is a place where you would land and identify, needing to reflect on that, and then reflect on what the advantage of the opposite place might be. So I really, actually, the more I think with your example, Heather, the more I like it. I could give an example from my own situation, right, where I am trained in the study of religion, and so, but particularly India. So where I landed in terms of thinking about who I identified with, interestingly, was the Norman Wurzba would be the closest thing to where I live, even though I'm a scholar of India. And I got very interested in his religious perspective, right, on what he was saying. So what deepened for me my own perspective on how we might think about food and the land and so on was Sharon Holland's critique of Norman Wurzbach, which is, let's think about ownership more broadly than just how Americans have used the land. So that would be my answer to the first and the second question, right? Where I come from as a scholar of religion was Wurzbach. This is why. Secondly, where I was challenged was by Holland's critique. And then who's the most opposite? Britt Barter by a long shot, right? What can I learn? That's number 3 in my paper. What can I learn from Britt Barter? Among many things is looking at the actual economics of where we are in the last 3 years in terms of the formation of companies, the consolidation of companies, and the use of sovereign funds. How does that change my perspective as a scholar of religion? Do I think about the ethics of business differently? Do I think about the power of critique from a religious perspective differently when my guess is that those mega companies, those Death Stars as he called it, are really not thinking about things like what Wendell Berry is writing about, right? And so, but I still need to think about that differently, right? So what are the ethics and religious perspectives, I would say, as a scholar of religion around hugely consolidated companies? New question that emerged for me, completely new out of this class. So does that give you a good example of kind of how you'd go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3? Yes, no, maybe? That's one. Okay, good. Thank you for the yes.
I also wanted to just quickly say that all of your departments have home pages in which they have a rationale for the department on the home page. You can quote that. You can work with it. You can, try to use it as a lens to see your own. It's only 10 classes, I know. Sometimes it's 8, but still they formed you.
Yeah, and why? What drew you to that? Some reflection on that in relationship to what drew you to your point of view in the perspective that you're thinking about. Right? Charlie.
What helped me in what you just said was that you were speaking from some of your own subjectivity,
Right.
your own experience, your own personhood, in addition to representing the discipline. And I'm thinking that maybe some people are frightened about having to represent an entire discipline, when what you were saying is more about how you come to this discussion through a discipline, but it's still about you.
Right.
Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And in this paper, don't be afraid to talk about, here's the reason why I became an X major or a Y major, and here's the connection to the particular perspective on food that I most resonate with. And here's why I most resonate with that perspective, and go from there. Here's what I learned that deepened that perspective, step 2, and here's the opposite perspective and how that shaped me as well. That would be step 3. So, is that clear?
This
People
is your
get where we're
last
going?
chance to ask questions of us here.
Aside from long emails to Kathy Rudy in the middle of the night, and I promise you she will answer at length. Any other? Yes.
Kind of an unrelated question, but you mentioned several times the class lectures are recorded. Where exactly are they available to Sakai?
Are they on?
They're not on Sakai, and then now.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So they're not actually located on Sakai, but there's an announcement on Sakai, which is the link. It's on the Trinity website.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else want to throw out an example and we can work with it before we move to today? Thoughts? Yes, sir.
Investigating journalism versus
Cool.
business. So like one side is producing, the other side is overseeing.
Very interesting. Okay, so tell me more about what drew you to investigative journalism. Are you from the School of Public Policy?
I'm actually from the math department.
Math. Oh, that's right. I forgot about the math. And are you Paul? No.
It's almost Dan.
Dan. Oh. There's an A in there. I love that. Thank you so much. Dan, go ahead.
So anyway, I typically enjoy a high horse. So I came in expecting to hear the woes of business, and I actually was surprised to find that there were some very strong points for actually going through with an entrepreneurial approach to
Okay, so, and if I might suggest the beginning, and I'm not sure you can tell me if this is right, your interest in investigative journalism came in part from an engagement with thinking about the food industry, thinking about how the practice of the food industry need to be reformed, a more analytical approach to what we do in our food practices every day, and deepening, and we got a lot of that. You would probably name one or two of the folks who might have exposed that, looked at that more closely. There are any number of lectures that I can think of that would do that. Step two, what the deepening of that might look like. And step three would be moving to looking at actual business practices, both possibly Fitzsimmons might be one, Barter might be another, there's several of them, and thinking about ways in which one could make an argument for certainly continuing with the exposition of the food industry, but also creating a space for engaging with the food industry as well. That's a basic outline. Is that what you're thinking about a little bit?
Well, that's where it's sort of confusing.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I understand selecting two fields that are discordant. That is clear.
Yeah.
Okay, the next thing is locating yourself in the conversation. I know what my personal view is. I can say how they affect you. And then third, I was going to say how the sort of building up the logic behind the arguments of your side is what is most interesting to me in class.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of my discipline take, I think. I think that's about as mathematical as
Sure. I think the first thing that you said had to do with engaging with the business side of things as becoming a different point of view that you now see as possibly necessary to your first. Correct?
Yes.
Right. So say a little more about that.
I mean, you sort of view it like your ego and super ego. Like your id, business, get it done. Your ego, I'm not necessarily doing it right. Or your super ego is I'm not necessarily doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
Your ego is the demand for food, like the demand of consumer places.
Okay, interesting. So that's your sort of your ending place is a more holistic perspective, which includes all of those.
Sure.
Okay, I think that would be a great conclusion to a paper like that. Sure. That's a nice example. Any other ones before we move on? Yes?
I'm just not exactly sure what the difference between the second and third point.
Do you want to jump in? I mean, I can add something to this.
Well, I mean, the second one is sort of like how you got to see yourself in relation to your disciplinary roots. And the third is how you got to see yourself in relation to your disciplinary roots with another guy shining his light on you. You know, like, how does yours come into sharp relief once you see something else?
So, again, to take myself as an example, Norman Wurzbach was where I was interested in thinking about theology, a spiritual approach to food, to land and food. Remember what I said was number two was how we might think about Sharon Holland's critique is deepening that, but still having a perspective that honors religious approaches to land. And so that's a deepening of my own approach, making it better. But it's not necessarily oppositional. It's coming from the same basic idea that you still could have a religious idea of land and food. But Britt Barter's perspective had nothing to do with that. It was completely different than that. And that would be the, not the deepening, but the oppositional
And in fact,
idea.
you almost can't have a spiritual relationship with land and food in his world.
Yeah,
And
well, that's
how-
the interesting
And how do you
conversation.
think then about your
Right.
commitment
Right.
to spiritual land and food in a world where, you know, all this stuff is coming down?
Right.
And that is the new light, the secondary light that you have to think about your own world in relation to.
So number two is a deepening and expanding of your own perspective, and number three is the opposition. Does that help? Okay.
Does
Good.
the opposition help you make your world more clear, or does it actually call into question?
And your answer is going to be different
Yeah, yeah.
every single time.
It's about the argument.
Okay, so we're willing to, yes, one more.
Procedural coverage.
Oh, good, yay.
The first paper had reference requirements.
Yeah, we have them on this one too.
Okay.
How do we get that up? Yeah, it's in there. And there's no external, but there is internal. Can you go down, scroll down? All the way, keep going. Right here, make sure you, no outside references need to be included, but you are welcome to use them if they strengthen your argument. At least 5 sources from within the class must be cited. They can also be videos.
Yeah.
The two library site for Chicago Manual is a little incomplete, so I would suggest people go to the Chicago Manual site themselves.
Okay.
Because there was some confusion about the 2 different sources.
Okay.
Okay, Chicago Manual style, go straight there. Okay, good. So briefly to recap, what is your disciplinary approach? How does it connect with your approach to food? How was that approach deepened and expanded? What is the opposite approach that you least agreed with? And how does that enrich and change your approach? Simple and clear. Follow those 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll be fine. All right, we're really looking forward to it because I can already tell from these examples that there's going to be some great papers. All right. So now I get to switch hats. Yay. All right. So we are now going to enter, like the discussion about meat eating, we're going to enter another conversation about GM, which has come up a lot in this class, and I'm really excited that we have 2 eminent women scientists to help us think this question through. I want to introduce and then do a little bit of framing and turn it over to our speakers. Our first presenter today will be Dr. Claudia Gunsch, who began her academic career at Purdue University, where she earned her BS in civil engineering in 1998. She then matriculated to Clemson, where she earned an MS in 2000 and immediately entered the doctoral program at University of Texas at Austin. She comes to Duke with a wide range of research experiences in microbial engineering systems. Her research has primarily focused on pollutant degradation as applied to groundwater and air pollution treatment, which is really interesting. And she particularly began early focusing on chlorinated compound degradation by bacteria in groundwater. And she also is looking at fungal degradation of aromatic compounds in biofiltration, and I'm sure she'll tell us what that means. As part of her innovative research, she incorporates quantitative molecular biological techniques, and I think she's just going to have some very interesting things to say about the link between biotechnology to environmental engineering applications. And that's really where she's continued to really make major contributions to the field of environmental engineering. So please join me in welcoming Claudia Gunsch. And our second speaker is Mary Eubanks, who got her PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1997. She specializes in genetics, genomics, evolution, ecology, and population biology. Her research is in maize evolution and improvement, and her current projects are looking at drought-tolerant maize, high-protein maize, insect-resistant and tolerant maize, and nitrogen use efficiency in tolerant maize. And she talks about her research as the origin and evolution of maize, partly because this important economic plant is grown in more countries of the world than in any other crop, as we've heard from a number of different folks. It's undergone such radical transformation under domestication that it can no longer survive without human intervention, which is a very interesting statement. And the genesis and evolution of its complex genome has confounded maize geneticists and led to considerable controversy for decades. So she really works in this controversy, thinking about experimental breeding, archaeology, and comparative genomics. So some really interesting questions. So please join me in welcoming Mary Eubanks. And there's a very cool article in 2006 Duke Today on Mary's triumphant discovery and nurturing of a particular corn plant, and her face is in the middle of a big corn plant, and it's a wonderful little story. So, last week we asked you at the end of the course to think about the piece on the course website in the 1968 vigil at Duke, where what began as a march in honor of Martin Luther King became a larger vigil on behalf of a variety of workers at Duke. At the center of that were food workers. And the interesting thing, as we think about questions of migrant workers that came up last week, is that even today there are some concerns about workers, and there's a recent chapter, a group of students gathered to protest some of the challenges and concerns and abuses in the workplace for Latino workers. And this is an ongoing conversation that Duke continues to have, and I'm very proud of us as a university community for even having the conversation. But the essay that I asked all of us to read last week really dovetails with our discussion that we just had about the final papers. And one of the big questions is, what is the role of the multiple disciplines in changing our minds and thinking about social change, but in changing our minds? And we're asking you to really write an account of that. And many of us think that what we study for knowledge, we study to gain skills, we study to enter a profession. The university as a larger community has also been a place where academic freedom has allowed us to push society to become better, no matter what. So the article that we circulated to everybody really exposes that idea. How can a university push a society to become better? So in another way, in relationship to the final papers for this class, is what do differing locations in the university ask us to do? Which ones encourage us to participate in social change? Which ones equip us to negotiate the world as we find it? And how do we compare and contrast those two different agendas? And I think one of the things that really pushes us in the university is, as we think about the locations devoted to training us to succeed in the world, what are the background assumptions of those locations that push us in one way or another? In our conversations last week with Melinda and Charlie about farm workers, how do we think about whether we might resist the very clearly advocate position that Melinda began from? Who were the students that thought this was the right thing? Who were the students that thought this was the wrong thing? The mandate of the university is to bring us both perspectives and thinking about how advocacy can both be informed by and perhaps resisted by university perspectives. The role of the university, though, is to bring such perspectives, opposing perspectives, together. And so identifying the underlying presumptions of these different worldviews, where advocacy matters, where advocacy may not be the right thing, is exactly what we should be doing in higher education. And in the GM debate, which we're about to see today, we're bringing in two Duke researchers, one from engineering, one from biology, both of whom we anticipate are going to help us think about the advantages as well as some of the disadvantages of genetically modifying food in some fashion. This is one of the most contested issues in food politics today, with locavores and agrarians calling GM food frankenfood and demanding a complete halt to their production, and the opposition suggesting that we've always genetically modified foods, and whether it be through seed selection for 10,000 years or hybridization the last 150 years. And as we went back to the meat-eating question, the question of disenhancement, genetically engineering a chicken to suffer less, is that all that different from creating an industrial chicken who can reach 200% normal market weight in 49 days, right? Very interesting set of debates there. Isn't that what animal husbandry has always been about? There are lots of questions when it comes to genetically modified foods like this. And I think the role of the political nature of information as well as data can also be studied through this lens. Are GM foods good if they produce more profit? What if, along with more profit, they also bring essential nutrients to different populations that need it? Are GM foods accessible if they render food vastly more affordable? Or is the exposure to pesticides not worth the risk? And who should decide whether those risks are acceptable for general populations? So we want to end with that way of thinking about the GM debate as a way of connecting with our conversation just now about the final question prompt. How do we negotiate opposing questions? When are the moments when we're called on to be more prophetic on contemporary social issues or critical in defense of those very same issues? And when should we move beyond either position to come to an entirely new position? So I think moving into GM is really going to give us a very good case study for some of the things that we're also asking you to do in your final papers. So with that, I will turn it over to Claudia. Welcome.
All right. So this is all I need to do, right? Yep. Okay. All right. Just making sure I was doing all the right things. Is there a pointer? Or is this thing not a? Oh, this is a pointer. Okay. Yep. All right. I have a pointer. Great. Okay. So first off, I wanted to I thank the organizers for the course for inviting me, and I should say this is a little bit of a stretch from what I do research on. Especially from the introduction that was given. A lot of the research that I do in my lab is really looking at emerging contaminants, and I should say more than contaminants, emerging materials, and really trying to understand what their ecological impacts are. And also just trying to develop new technologies, looking at some of the problems that we have. So thinking about organisms, for instance, that have evolved resistance to some of our traditional treatment technologies for water disinfections and things like that. And this topic, genetic engineering and food, is actually really interesting because there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn between food as well as bacteria that are involved in, that we utilize for bioremediation, for biodegradation of contaminants. And so I'll try to allude to some of those, and hopefully, Mary has a lot more experience directly in the food industry, and so hopefully we can give you a good overview of all of that today. So what I plan on doing is kind of giving you, I know there's a wide variety of people that are enrolled in this class, so I'm going to start off with kind of giving you a basic overview of what do we mean, how do we actually genetically engineer food, and then we'll talk about some of the potential human health effects and what are some of the actual impacts, environmental impacts, human health impacts that are possible from genetically engineering food. Then we'll talk about the prevalence of genetically modified foods in the U.S., and then we'll talk about how these are regulated, and then I'll end up talking about world hunger and how genetically modified foods are viewed as a possibility for solving some of these problems. So I know it sounds like I haven't attended many of these classes. Actually, I haven't attended any of the classes, so I'm not entirely sure what's been talked about. But it sounds like genetically modified food has definitely been something that has come up. And so I wanted to kind of start with a survey before I jump into some of the material to kind of gauge from the class where you see genetically modified foods and how much of risk you actually see and what are some of the issues. So I'd just like a show of hands for those. Do you believe that genetically modified foods pose a health risk? So how many people would say yes?
Does this include pesticides or just like
Genetically modified, the food, the fact that we're modifying the food itself.
Do you mean like currently or in?
I'll say currently. Based off of what you know now, do you think that there's a health risk? So, okay, so that's yes. I'll say maybe a third. Who thinks no? And there will be a maybe. So, okay, and maybe the rest. Okay, so it's really a third. Okay, So do you believe genetically modified crops pose a risk to the environment? Okay, so say yes takes that one, no, and maybe. Okay, so yes, I would say it's probably about 75%, and then no is a very small percent. Do you favor labeling genetically modified products? Yes, okay, and no? Okay. All right, well, so that's interesting. That's right, but you guys are an educated crowd, and so I actually think this is great. Food is something we all deal with, right? We all have to consume food, but it's not really a topic that we talk about a lot. And for me, it wasn't something even that I considered until I had children, and I have 3 young children at home, and so really now being a parent and thinking about a lot of these things is really when the question. So I think, for people in college, I'd never thought about any of this stuff. So I think that's great. So it's interesting. There was a survey done in August of 2008, and the survey was commissioned by the International Food Information Council, and the results from that survey said that 65% of the 1,000 people that were interviewed knew nothing or had heard very little about genetically modified foods. And this is really interesting when you consider how much genetically modified foods are present. So does anybody know, and you guys might have talked about this, if you go to the grocery store, what percentage, in a regular grocery store, what percentage of foods on the shelf actually are genetically modified? Or contain a genetically modified ingredient? Yeah, sometime between there. I saw 70 and I saw 80%, so somewhere in that range. So it's really a really large number, and you consider that 65% of the people interviewed in 2008, which really wasn't that long ago, really had no idea. So I think that's an interesting thing. So we'll see how this changes as we go. Okay, so what is genetically modified food? So genetically modified food and what we're talking about with genetically modified food is when you take a gene from a foreign organism, something that would not be able to mingle normally with the crop of interest, and you actually take that gene and you insert it into the crop of interest. So this is something that would not happen naturally, is how I'll be defining it. So probably the best example of this is BT corn, so a corn that's been genetically engineered to be able to make a toxin. So the BT toxin is a toxin that's made by by a bacterium that is natively found in soil, and so we utilize this as an alternative to spraying insecticides. And you guys might have talked about that, and that's probably one of the most commonly used types of genetically engineering crops. So how do we actually carry this out? And for those of you that are biologists, I know somebody said they were evolutionary biologists, so this should look familiar. And for those of you that aren't scientists, I apologize, but hopefully we'll walk you through this. So the general idea is that we take a gene from a foreign organism. And so this might be from a bacterium, it might be from a virus, it might be from another plant, and we actually put it on a cassette right here. So this is a transgene cassette, and we take a series of genes. So it might be just one gene, but it might also be a series of genes. These genes, oh yeah, there it is. These genes can then be attached together, so we can use restriction enzymes to make them compatible. We then also have to have a selection marker, which is typically an antibiotic resistance gene. And then we perform these manipulations. We essentially stick everything together. We put it on a plasmid, and then the plasmid itself will be incorporated onto the chromosome of the plant of interest. There's numbers of different ways by which you can do this. One of the ways that I'm showing here is actually using agrobacterium, which is a bacteria that infects plants. And so actually up here on the top right is a picture of agrobacterium. I guess this thing works when it wants to, so maybe it doesn't work. I'll use the little pointer. Nope. Okay. And the top right up here, what you can see is a carrot cell that's actually being infected by agrobacterium. And so the way that this works, and so it's shown here in this little graph, so you do this manipulation, you then put you actually insert this into the agrobacterium, and agrobacterium has a TI plasmid which forms a pilus, which essentially you can think of it kind of as a little bridge between the bacterium and the plant cell, and it injects that genetic material in here. Once it's been injected, we now have a transformed cell, and we can utilize that to actually grow a plant from it. So that's one way of doing it. There's a number of other ways. You can utilize nanoparticles that actually contain this genetic material. You can utilize gene guns to actually shoot it right into your cell. And there's a variety of different ways that you can actually do this. So this is what is referred to as transgenesis. And so transgenesis is really when you're taking a gene from two different organisms that would not mate, that would not come into contact, or there wouldn't be any crossbreeding typically. So that's as opposed to cisgenesis, where cisgenesis is really when you actually when there is possible breeding, and that's what happens, what would happen naturally.
Would that be a hybrid?
Yes, the cisgenesis. So like looking at the trans hybrids, and that's where a lot of Mary's experience will come in. All right, so the question becomes, why would we want to genetically engineer food? And so I think the vast majority of why we genetically engineer food is really on this first bullet. And so the general concept behind wanting to genetically engineer food is an improvement of the value of that plant. That could be an agricultural value, if we think it's going to make more protein, if we think it's going to be more resistant, more drought resistant. So there's lots of different angles that have been taken for wanting to genetically engineer food. There could be additional ornamental value of a crop, make it more resistant to a variety of parameters. So a number of things that have been genetically engineered, so insecticidal activity, for instance, protection from viral infection, resistance to herbicides, protection from pathogenic fungi, delay of aging, tolerance of environmental stress, changing pigmentation, for instance, improve the natural quality of seed protein, and then also increase post-harvest shelf life has also been another reason for genetic engineering. And really today what I'm going to do, I'm focusing mostly, I should say, on crops. There are crops that are actually, obviously, since we have these 70 to 80% of our products at the grocery store that do contain these genetically modified plants. I should say that there's also a lot of research that's going on into genetically modified animals. And so probably the best example of that is genetically modified salmon, which is not yet approved for us to be able to consume, but there's a lot of research that's been going on in that, and it looks like it's moving along. And so the genetically engineered salmon, and I'm not sure if you guys have talked about this, but it's a company named Aqua Bounty that is working on this, and they've been working on it for a number of years, but they've added a growth hormone to the fish, which allows it to grow twice as quickly. And the reason that it hasn't been approved is that they have yet to be able to show a failure analysis. And so what that means is essentially they haven't been able to show what would happen if one of these salmon actually got out and came into contact with wild salmon. And so that work, or at least is ongoing currently. And so supposedly these fish are sterile, but there's always going to be a small percentage of these fish that are not sterile. And so there is the concern that if one of those got out into the environment, we don't necessarily know what the impacts of that would actually be. Okay, so that covers number one. The second one, which I think is where even a lot of people that might disagree with the first one, a lot of people can see the value in the second bullet. When we can actually utilize plants as bioreactors to be able to make things, and so here we're talking about actually being able to use these as for making therapeutic agents or diagnostic types of tools. And so there are some other attributes beyond the ones that we might typically think of for genetically modified foods as the ones that we go to the grocery store and actually get. So those are, or edible vaccines was another one that's also been utilized. And finally, just for science in general, we can utilize plants to study the action of genes. So just like we just as we utilize bacteria to better understand function of a variety of genes, we can also utilize plants. And the third bullet is really, it's a much more controlled environment. So I think this is somebody in a lab that's actually working with these things, and so it's a little bit more controlled. Okay. So currently in the U.S., 85% of our corn is genetically engineered, 91% of our soybeans, and 88% of our cotton. And also, it's estimated that up to 95% of sugar beets are also genetically engineered. So it's interesting to look at where we fall if we look at globally where genetic crops are actually harvested. And so you can see that we are by far actually the leading country for crops. And so this is a somewhat aged figure here, but you can see the progression of how that has evolved. So starting in 1996, which we only had 1.5 million hectares that were dedicated to genetic engineered crops, all the way up to 54.6. And so these are showing kind of the leading countries where these foods are found. And so globally, so as of 2011, there were 29 countries where crops, genetically modified crops, were actually grown. And even though in our country it's somewhere on the order of 50 to 60%, I think, are genetically modified, if you look globally, it's only about 10% of crops in the world that are genetically modified. So some of the interesting things to keep in mind is, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is that genetically modified crops, even though might have very similar properties to the wild type crop, there are other things that we need to consider, and every person is different, and so every person is going to, or is likely to, react differently to these compounds, or to these genetically modified foods. And so one of the biggest challenges with genetically modified foods is determining what the allergenicity potential is in human beings. And so the way that this is currently done is you look at the genome. So you look at the protein sequence for the genetically modified product or crop, and you compare it to the wild type. You also look at comparing those sequences to the sequences of known allergens. And so this is very controversial, because depending on what the length of the sequence that you actually look at, you might get a different answer. So if it's too short, you might not find matches. If it's too large, you might find more matches. So there's controversy as far as even how to carry out these tests. And so this is really important, because the actual reactions in people can vary all the way from, this is showing a skin rash, which is skin rash, you might get a skin rash and it's going to go away. And we probably all gotten skin rashes at some point that, we don't necessarily always know what they've come from. But some people can actually go into anaphylactic shock. And probably the best example of this was an example back in 2000 when somebody was eating a taco and actually went into anaphylactic shock, and this was at work, and they rushed the person to the hospital, and when they came back, there was still half taco eaten on her desk, and they could actually pinpoint that back to the presence of this genetically modified corn that was found in there. So there can be a lot of drastic effects. There's been an increase in allergies, and it's, again, hard to say. There's a lot of different properties. There's a lot of different things that we have to consider. So it's a very interesting scientific question to actually consider. Another important impact to look at is the environmental impact. And so we have engineered these plants. So this is a Roundup. So we've genetically modified a number of crops to be Roundup resistant, so it would be very easy to be able to spray them. But as a result, things that we're trying to get rid of, such as weeds, have evolved resistance to these products. And so this is an example of pigweed here in North Carolina, and it's also present in a number of other states. But this pigweed is actually now Roundup resistant, and so there's been some controversy as far as, should we be trying to spray different types of herbicides, trying to kind of mix it up, just like we do with antibiotics, to try to protect against the development of antibiotic resistance. Do we need to kind of mix up the different antibiotics to make sure that we try to minimize that as much as possible? So this has gotten so bad in some crops that actually, so it's usually in soybeans and cotton fields where this has been a problem, but there are actually cases where the pigweed actually grows so rampantly that they've had to scrap the entire crop, where you actually cannot harvest the crop itself. So that's an interesting thing to think about. And the last one that I want to talk about is the impact on biodiversity and contamination of genetic resources. And so this is something that in my research I spent a lot of time thinking about, looking at when we introduce these new materials or these new contaminants in the environment, what are the long-term impacts to native microbial species? Are we disturbing ecological functions? Are we disturbing nitrogen cycling? Are we disturbing carbon cycling? And same here when we look at it from the crop perspective. The introduction of these pest resistance genes can actually have impacts. And so a lot of it is linked to the pollen, and the pollen that's actually being produced that can have deleterious effects to important organisms in our ecosystem. And so this is an example of the butterfly, the monarch butterfly, which can be impacted with corn pollen that has been genetically modified. And then there's been a number of instances where there's actually been collapse of the beehives. And so what I mean by a collapse of a beehive, somewhere in the order of like 30 to 95% of the bees just stop growing. And so there's been some indication that this is linked to an increase in pesticides, where they are being either exposed directly to the pesticides, because we don't have to worry about that because we can spray these crops because they're resistant to the pesticides, or there could also be some links directly with the genetic modification. And then here, this is an example of with the ladybugs, which also can be fatal with some types of transgenic corns. So I should point out, so bees obviously, so beyond the fact that the collapse of these colonies is a problem, bees do pollinate most of our important crops. So corn, cotton, canola, soybeans, these are all pollinated by bees. And so there are drastic consequences, I guess, of these modifications. So in the U.S., we have what is known as a coordinated framework to look at genetically modified foods. And so the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA all play a role in this, and they each have their little piece of the pie. They each consider different components components of this. So the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, oversees food safety. And the approach that the Food and Drug Administration takes is looking at making sure that these genetically modified foods are generally regarded as safe. And so this falls under, so the way that they go about this is actually looking at documents that have been given to them by the manufacturer of the genetically modified crop, and they look at the science, or they look at the studies, and based off of that, determine if the genetically modified food is similar to the original, but they don't perform any third-party testing of that. It's really more of a consulting view of actually looking at the data that is given to them. So this is where these database protein comparison searches would come in that I talked about earlier. And like I said, there's some controversies about what lengths of proteins do we actually want to look at. The other thing to keep in mind is that even when we ingest these genetically modified food, the allergenic reaction isn't necessarily something that happens instantaneously. This might be an actual byproduct of an initial reaction, and so that's not really covered there. The second one, so the Environmental Protection Agencies oversees the safety of testing of pesticides, and so this is where the crops that have been genetically engineered to produce the Bt toxin, for instance, that would fall under this category. And then finally, the USDA is the one that issues permits for the new GMO crop fields. So there's really, they all play different roles in this, but there's not really one organization that actually oversees the whole thing. And so it's interesting to look at how our policies vary compared to the European Union policies. And so the United States policy is really looking at substantial equivalence. And so what we look at is that the genetically modified food is similar to the original pre-modified modified food. And so if the metabolic profiling, the protein profiling, and all of this is similar, then we essentially assume that it's the same, that there's no effect. And so probably, and of course there's obviously some controversy about whether that's an appropriate way of looking at it. And one of the best examples of this is probably back in the late, so it was back in the late 90s? Was it in the late 90s? Where there was a food supplement, the cysteine food supplement that was produced, and it was looked as being safe and being similar, and actually a number of people got sick, and they found out that in that genetically, by producing this supplement, we were actually making something else in addition to the actual cysteine itself, and that was causing problem, and there were a number of fatalities as a result of this. And so that's the approach that we've taken. And a lot of the people that are in favor of this, we say that we've been eating genetically engineered foods for a long time and looking at the effects, and so the proponents of this policy are usually on that side. The opposite is the precautionary principle, and that's really the one by which the European Union abides in. So in that principle, they want to know that there is no effect initially. And so there's a number of countries in the European Union, it's just the UK, where you can't actually find genetically engineered. They won't allow you to plant it. They won't allow you to sell it. And if they do sell it, you have to actually have a label so that everybody knows what you're actually buying. And so that brings me to the non-GMO project. And so probably one of the biggest controversies is, or I guess things that we can talk about, is the fact that a vast majority of people just do not know that they're consuming genetically modified foods. And people should have the ability to make a choice, make an informed choice, and also to verify that the foods that you're actually eating are genetically modified or are not. And so that's what the Non-GMO Project is this third party that essentially verifies that your food is non-genetically modified, because there's always the potential of this cross-contamination. So these are some of the companies that are part of the Non-GMO Project. And there's a number of tests that are based off of looking for genetic markers in the actual foods that will allow this third party to verify that the food is in fact not genetically modified. So there's a number of organizations. This is obviously, as you're aware, a very hot topic. And so there's a number of organizations that are that try to inform the public, that would like to see more labeling out there. And these are a few of the a few of the organizations that are behind this. Okay, so it's interesting to note, if you look at kind of the map here of the world, the places where labeling is not required and those where it is required. And as you can see, it's mostly North America and the rest of the world. So North America, where we are not required, we as consumers don't know if we are consuming genetically modified food, whereas in the other parts of the world, there is labeling going on. And so I think when we talk about genetically modified foods, usually one of the poster child that we put up there is world hunger. And this is a way, by modifying food, we can solve world hunger. We can make plants that have higher yield. We can make plants that are drought resistant. We can make plants that will, have these edible vaccines. We can solve the problems. And if you look at the science behind a lot of these studies, there's actually a lot of controversy over, are we actually improving the food? Is the yield better? Is the protein content better? Is the nutritional value of these foods better? So are we really doing these people service by producing these genetically modified foods? And I think there's a lot of controversy depending on which side of the argument you are actually on, and that actually makes it difficult, I think, for most people to actually be able to see to get that message. And there's more than just the science. There's also a lot of social implications that come into this. And so, for instance, in 2010, the Indian Environment Minister imposed a moratorium on cultivation of genetically modified foods, just because there were issues associated with that. I know there's a lot of issues in other places, and so there's been a lot of work in consumer acceptance of genetically modified food, which also needs to be better rooted in the science. And so, again, I'll leave it at I'll leave you, I guess, with this: is this the solution? Are there other ways that we can solve world hunger, or is genetically modified food really the only answer to this? And Mary will have a lot to say about that, so I'll leave it there
For a fabulous, really well organized, informative presentation to give us an overview, Professor Gunch, and Professor Eubanks really giving us a state-of-the-art what's at stake and what Duke's role in this debate is. I'll have a little bit more to say about that at the end, but let's open up for questions, too.
Oh, it's just a technical question. Does that mean that we can't post the presentation on?
I already sent Kathy Lewis an email to find out about that. Let's not worry
So we're already, the course is radicalizing everyone here. Okay. I should also mention to the two of you, I have to repeat the questions because of the recording situation. And if you want to all come up, that's probably easier. My guess is there are a lot of questions. And I think Dan, formerly known as Paul, is going to ask the first question.
Do you want these things on?
Yeah, you need to keep that on. Yeah. Can you keep it to one, just because I want to give other folks a chance? Yeah, thanks.
Does the gene confer resistance to the pests? Does that when it naturally occurs?
You're talking about the BT?
Hang on.
Oh, sorry.
Does the gene which confers resistance to the pest, does it also naturally occur?
Well, the question is when it naturally occurs, it's also anaphylactic.
Right. So when the gene that resistant to the pest, when it naturally occurs, does it also cause anaphylactic reaction? And that can be probably, my guess is Professor Eubanks.
I can answer that. The BT gene is a gene in a bacterium called Bacterium
Bacillus.
thuringiensis. And that is actually used by organic farmers to spray on their crops to, and it's approved for organic because it's a natural, it's completely natural, and it biodegrades very, very rapidly in nature. And I've used it, and I didn't have a problem. So that raises a question, since I've had the allergic reaction to BT. A very good question is, you remember the cassette that Dr. Gunst showed? There are, for one thing, in the BT corn, there's a promoter in that cassette which makes it express that toxin at much, much higher levels than it would ever be found in nature. I mean, hugely high levels. So that gets into some other issues, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, great. Okay. And bioengineering and Dan. And you also, if you could tell our lecturers where you're from. Yeah.
I'm a biologist. My question is this. So modern farmers don't save seeds from one generation to the next. They're buying their seeds, right? Do you think that if we encourage farmers to save seeds and thereby allow their crops to keep evolving, we'd end up with crops that were more resistant to these pests?
So modern farmers don't save seeds from one generation to the next. If we did encourage farmers to save seeds, would we allow them to encourage crops that were more resistant to the pests?
I can take a stab at it. So you're talking about like organic farming, so foods that have not been genetically modified?
Well, it just seems to me that for most of our history, farmers saved their seeds and planted the next year's crops from what they had the previous year. But now it seems like, especially, actually not organic, but big agriculture is buying their seeds. Not necessarily from Monsanto, but even if they're buying hybrid seeds, those get purchased every year. Somebody has to produce them.
Right.
We essentially stop plants from evolving.
Yeah.
Whereas if we let them go and just took it from one direction to the next, we might end up with pests.
I would definitely say that there's some truth to that, and you can add to it.
Well-
I think that's definitely a much better way to approach it and actually let nature do what it does.
Well, hybrids do reproduce, but the thing is, what industrial agriculture is based on hybridization and hybrids, hybrid seed. And so what these companies is, they have their secret inbreds, and they'll combine two inbreds to make their special hybrid that they're going to sell to you. And if you save the seed and you grow the hybrid, I mean, even if you could, now there's contracts, you can't do it, at least with corn. Maybe, but if you save that seed and you grow it the next year, you may get 30% of the yield you got when you planted that F1 hybrid. It's a thing called hybrid vigor. So what he's asking, a really great question, because it used to be that things were open pollinated and crops we had open pollinated hybrids. But now with industrial agriculture and the whole concept of hybrid vigor, we have these we have companies that have evolved, and they have their own hybrid seed that they sell, and that really gives you the much better yields. So that, it's a complicated question. A lot of organic organic farmers do save seed. And then they have, even with corn, they have open pollinated varieties, but you're not going to get those kinds of yields. So it's only for specialty crops that will work.
Okay, in the back, way in the back, if you could introduce yourself.
My name is Michelle. I'm an international comparative studies and Asian and Middle Eastern studies double major, and I'm a biology minor. So my question is, what about the wild relative of corn that you study? How has that and the corn rootworm evolved in tandem so that the corn rootworm is not resistant to whatever common? Like, what is it about that variety that prevents the corn rootworm from eating it, and why hasn't the corn rootworm necessarily found a way around that?
Okay, it's a great question.
I'm so sorry, I have to repeat it.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's Rochelle or Michelle? Michelle asks, what about the wild relative of the corn how has it evolved so that the corn rootworm involved in tandem with the corn and did not, in fact, devour the corn? And how come the corn rootworm didn't evolve again to get around that very co-evolution that you began your presentation with?
Yeah, and that is a great question. And we don't fully know the mechanism, but we are pretty sure it's because the wild relative of corn has air passages in the roots called arenchyma. You're a biology minor, so you'll know it's the technical terms are arenchyma, but they're just, the roots have holes in them. They're air passages. And so the corn that I have developed in the crossbreeding actually also has the arenchyma, whereas the normal corn has very solid roots that those little bugs get in there and they eat them and they're just chewing down. But in mine, we think, and we've hypothesized, and we've done some experiments that show, they're just not getting enough nutrient. So they actually live, but they're tiny, and they probably are not reproducing as much. But they must have some value in nature, and so we think that's the mechanism for the coevolution, and we just brought that in. Yeah.
Great. Two more questions back there. Yes. Yeah.
My name is
Emily.
I'm also an ICS major with public policy and English minor. And so I guess that I would first like to point out that we always look at like GMO and non-GMO as this dichotomy, but you've presented a third stance, which I still feel is very anthropocentric. So it's centered on somehow getting this corn crop to a way where humans can take advantage of it and looking at it as its usefulness to humans. Which you just said you see that there's some reason why we have these pests have evolved with this other natural crop because there's some usefulness in nature for them, right? So my question is, because this approach still is very anthropocentric, what about the predators of the rootworms, right? So the BT gene that has been killing all of these rootworms has just completely knocked them out. But we look at that as oh great, these rootworms, they're dying off, that's awesome because now we have this corn for humans to eat. But has anyone looked at whatever eats the rootworm, or what role that rootworm serves in society, and how that's affecting the larger cycles of nature? Does that make sense? And even your way of doing it by taking this natural gene and implanting it in this corn has deprived the rootworm of their food. And so again, is necessarily knocking out some of this rootworm population and disrupting these natural cycles. And I guess I'm wondering, has anyone looked beyond just the anthropocentric perspective on this?
I love Emily's questions for summary. So Emily's question is that what she really appreciates about the lecture is that the debate is usually GMO and non-GMO. Now we've been thinking about a third stance and how interesting that is. But she wonders whether it's still a little bit too anthropocentric because it still focuses on getting the corn crop for use in humans. But and particularly when we think about the rootworms, that we can celebrate the fact that BT has killed the rootworms, or other ways of thinking about minimizing the rootworms. But what about the role of rootworms in the larger ecology and the larger cycle of the food chain? Who are we also depriving? What other species or animals or plants might we also be depriving by getting rid of the rootworm? Is that all right? Okay.
That's a great summary of a very complex question,
It's
and
my
it's a
job.
great question. And it's one, actually, I love the question because I think about that a lot. But the rootworm is getting back at us. You know, we think with the BT we're killing it. We haven't killed it. It's coming back with a vengeance because it's already evolved resistance to the BT gene. So, so insects do that. But the other one about the corn rootworm has a lot of other host plants, other grasses in nature. So, but still, you know, it's good to think about the positive role in ecology that this insect may play. And I don't know the answer, and as long as I've been reading and studying and working with it, I don't think anybody's looked at that. It's an area for some student to come along and explore.
Who have looked at it are the folks, the permaculturalists, and the folks who are saying we should be hunter-gatherers. And just to remind the class, Lori, that was Manning that we read very early in the semester. That agriculture itself disrupted ecosystems, and the only way not to do that is to give up agriculture.
So the people, Kathy reminds the people who have looked at this are the permaculturalists, because they argue that agriculture itself interrupted these kinds of ecocycles that we need to look back at. And Manning, in particular, the reading in Manning, suggests that we need to think about the whole idea of agriculture in this very light that Emily's suggesting. We have time for one more question, which is... I'm so sorry, yeah, Professor Gooch.
So I think that's actually the biggest issue. This is speaking from an environmental engineering perspective. So I really feel, not specifically for food, but a lot of the research that we do is looking at these contaminants that we're introducing, and maybe they've got this great immediate impact. They kill those microbes that could cause an infection, but what are the long-term impacts of that action? And those are the hardest questions. We look at microbial communities, and we can show, for instance, like nanosilver. We know nanosilver kills bacteria, and the question is, does it matter? There's other bugs that can do the exact same thing. Is it ecologically, is it an important question? And that's a really, really tough question to ask, because we can show that there is an impact, an immediate impact, but looking at that global impact is a really difficult thing to actually assess. And so I really feel that this is where this type of research needs to head. So I think that's a great question, and I think that kind of sums up everything right there about the implications.
Great. One last question. Really quick. Name, where you from? Right.
Okay. So you had mentioned in your slide that GM foods can cause infertility or the risk of fertility. Can you expand on that?
Thank you, Heidi. So Heidi wants to know, in one of the slides it was mentioned that GM foods cause infertility or reduce fertility. Can you expand on that?
Not really, because we can't do the research, but there is one study out of Europe that indicates that possibility. So it's just,
that's
we don't know.
one of the indications, yeah. Okay, so just to end, I want to remind you, one of the things that we've been focusing on this class is the clumsy solution, the multiple solution. And what really struck me about these two presentations, particularly as we were talking about research and the capacity for research, is that as long as we think about GM as a silver bullet and the only silver bullet, we are going to have a problem. But if we think about multiple solutions in a number of different contexts, as Professor Eubanks was talking about at the end, then we're going to have a different approach. And we might also, if GM is not the only silver bullet and therefore creating a certain kind of closed environment around research, we might have a more open environment around research as well. So that's point number one, back to the clumsy solution and why it works a little bit better and is more empirically verifiable to think about multiple solutions to any issue. And second, the fact that the university is now playing a key role in opening up the possibility of research and negotiating these contracts is exactly the kind of thing that universities should be doing. We are all about opening up knowledge, and if we have to do it step by step to negotiate with corporation by corporation, with a sense that what they could be doing is possibly beneficial, we are going to create constructive results. So I think this was a really good example of several of the principles in the class. Okay, I think we can go to dinner.